My dad, Larry Linton, the only true servant leader willing to stand in the arena and fight for your freedoms.
Larry is a man of God, and he will move heaven and earth to protect the people in district.
Too many elected politicians act like chameleons.
My name is Mike. I'm Larry's neighbor. I bought the house behind him. I trust Larry to give me an honest answer.
And what's important to me is faith, family, and my freedom. And I believe these values are also held by Larry Linton.
More important than ever, I believe, in our lifetime to really stand up and fight for what's right. And Larry's doing that, and I'm in support of it.
We need to replace career politicians in Nashville with leaders willing to stand for what is right, even if it's not popular. People who feel a calling and are not looking to make a profession out of it.
You're not going to find a more honest, straightforward, and passionate individual, I don't believe. Larry is what you see is what you get. He's honest.
Listen, if you are looking for a true conservative who's passionate about the state of Tennessee, the people that live in it, and wanting to make a difference in a meaningful way, Larry's your guy.
Good Monday morning, folks. Once again, this episode is being released as I'm making my way home from Wyoming this week. Before we get too deep, though, I want to ask the audience to join with me in lifting up the many people affected by Hurricane Helene recently. The widespread death and destruction is nearly overwhelming. Thankfully, it didn't impact my home nor my daughter's home, and both of my girls, along with the puppies, they're safe. Kaylee's home did suffer a power surge, possibly from a close-by lightning strike or something, and it killed a bunch of electronics in her house. But those things, they can be replaced. Many people in Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida lost more than just material possessions. They lost their lives. I'm grieving for all those families that lost loved ones and lost everything they owned. So please, keep all those affected in your prayers along with me. Now, I just wrapped up my latest coaching engagement with the well servicing crews in the Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota areas. I did not visit as many states during this engagement as I did on my last one, but the number is still impressive. Colorado, even though that one was only for a couple of layovers, and then it was on to Wyoming, South and North Dakota, and finally some work out in the field around Baker, Montana. I want to send a shout out to the audience members that interacted with my poll on the Spotify episode, as well as the comments on the podcast page on Facebook. If you follow the podcast page on Facebook, you would have seen that the big tech overlords over at ScrewTube took down last week's episode. They said it violated that site's community guidelines, which is funny in and of itself. I submitted an appeal, of course, and it was promptly denied. I mean, extremely promptly. It took less than 5 minutes for them to review the 40-plus minute episode so they could determine the episode still violated their guidelines. Which means two things, really. The first one is they really didn't review the episode at all. The second one is by violating their community standards or guidelines, it means that their guidelines, they must state that you cannot use the commie's own words against them to prove they are liars. Because last week's episode was mostly made up of video clips of the commies talking out of both sides of their mouths. There will be some more video clips in this week's episode that show some of the same things, but they are also shown to demonstrate that these people in leadership positions, both in government and in the legacy mainstream media, they are really just wolves in sheep's clothing. I specifically want to drill down on some of the news coverage right after the second attempt to unalive President Trump. Using some careful words there, did you notice? Anyway, I'll show you some attempts of the legacy media to cover their tracks, both in the past and while going forward into the future. A good rule of thumb that I have developed over the past few years, folks, is this. Whenever the talking heads on TV are trying to tell us something, it means the complete opposite is true. This applies to government agencies as well. Agencies that are funded by our tax dollars that are supposed to be helping the people of Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee out in their time of need, but are doing the opposite. As we'll discuss a little bit. So now, with a recap and intro completed, let's get on with this week's episode of the Liberty Leadership and Life podcast, where I will once again warn the audience about what the politicians, that I often refer to as trans-publicans, and their partners, the commies, along with the useful idiots in the legacy mainstream media, as well as those government agencies that are paid by our tax dollars, they are nothing more than the proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing. So let's take a stand together in the arena again this week, folks, and get on with the show.
Welcome to the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast. On this show, we will discuss the assaults on our liberty by the very institution we the people created to secure our liberty. We will also compare and contrast the actions of people in leadership positions to the servant leadership that is needed to protect our God-given, constitutionally protected rights. Additionally, we will break down the many lies that elected and unelected officials in government and media spin every day in order to secure for themselves positions of power and influence that are antithetical to the system of government our founding fathers created and passed down to us.
Good morning once again, folks. Just a quick episode this week, unlike last week's show. It's been pretty busy up here in Wyoming, wrapping up this engagement, preparing for the return trip home. I want to start off this segment with a clip of Jesse Kelly with Tucker Carlson that, in 2 minutes, describes a problem with primary voting in Texas, but just as equally applies here in Tennessee. We have spoken about the primary election races here in Tennessee and how the participation rates by Republican voters, it's extremely problematic. I did want to get this video clip into last week's episode because Jesse talks a bit about United States Senator Lankford, and he does it in quite a descriptive manner. That was not the reason why I wanted to include it, though, but for another reason, which we'll talk about on the other side. Give it a watch, but for the voters that are in quote-unquote red states, think about what it means for you, and especially here in Tennessee. Here it is.
But we have a primary voter problem because the reddest states, they are sending the most putrid losers to Washington, D.C. John Thune, John Cornyn, Mitch McConnell, James Lankford, Naked Ken Doll Lankford out of Oklahoma. These people are from our reddest states.
Wait, what did you call him?
Naked Ken Doll. Have you ever seen a Naked Ken Doll? There's nothing there.
So, no, I'm not bragging. I've never taken off Ken's pants, but it's just...
Well, believe me, that's what you're going to find if you ever disrobe James. But the point
I'm
is...
I'm stealing that.
The point is, we have this red state, and because it is red... Look, I moved here on purpose. My wife and I, we had 2 kids. I moved here without a job because I love Texas people so much, because that's what we do. But that niceness can also burn us as well, because you move to a safe place. I'm in a neighborhood without crime. I'm in a state that's Republican. I have this, I have that. And you think to yourself, we're fine. We're not fine. The demons come for what is good. What is good. It's not an accident. If you've ever sat at home and you watched any of this child tranny stuff or anything like that before, and if you ever said something to yourself like, why the kids? Why can't they just leave the kids alone? People love saying that on the right. I don't understand why they can't leave the kids alone. The kids are where they went first, because the kids are the most good, because the kids are the most innocent. They're not going to come after me. I'm a horrible human being. The kids are the most innocent, and so that's why they went after them. Whatever is good, whatever is right, that's what the devil goes after first. And if you think your state of Texas is safe, it's the most unsafe, because these people look at you and your family and your values and your guns, and it's a reminder of everything they're not, and it's a reminder of everything that can stop them. So we're not safe, and we have to start getting more involved locally and in primaries. It is a disgrace that John Cornyn is a senator from this state. That should never happen again. Disgrace.
Well, what do you think? Of course, Tucker and Jesse are addressing a national audience, so Jesse was talking about national office holders. He really goes after Senator Lankford from Oklahoma, and I want to talk a bit about the terrible senator. He is just one of the many examples of what I refer to as trans-publicans, and that is, a trans-publican is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is almost like that serial killer in the movie Silence of the Lambs, the one that was making a skin suit out of his victim so he could pretend to be something he wasn't. Anyway, Senator Lankford was the author of that horrible border bill that is being touted by the left right now. If you didn't listen to last week's show where I mentioned that bill as it related to the 3-on-1 debate that President Trump participated in, here are some of the specifics of that bill. First, the border security bill that President Trump rightly called up members of Congress and told them to kill. That bill would have codified, meaning put into law, the border czar's catch and release policy. The Border Patrol agent that testified to Congress that I showed in last week's show called it the process and release policy, but catch and release is really what the commies in Washington, D.C. are directing them to do. And if you were paying any attention to the news last week, it should really frighten you about the level of depravity of those serving in Washington, D.C. as it relates to the difference in the treatment of the tax-paying citizens of this country and the replacement voters the new aristocracy is importing into the country. What I'm referring to here is data provided to a Tennessee congressman by ICE, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is another one of those 3-letter agencies funded by our tax dollars. Well, this taxpayer-funded agency reported that there are 13,099 non-detained catch and release, non-detained non-citizen criminals convicted of murder that were released into the nation's interior. That's into our neighborhood, folks. There were nearly 16,000 non-detained non-citizen criminals convicted of sexual assault that were caught and released into our country. In total, nearly 500,000 non-detained, non-citizen convicted criminals that our government, yes, the government that hates the tax-paying legal citizens of this republic, that our government released into our states, cities, towns, and neighborhoods. That border bill presented by so-called Republican Senator Lankford would have codified that action. Next big problem with that bill was it put a threshold of when to begin enforcement of our immigration laws along the southern border only after 1.8 million illegal aliens had crossed into the interior. Just peachy, right? That is our government, made up of communists and people that claim to be Republicans. That is our government telling us we'll only enforce the law after nearly 2 million people break the law in entering the country. That's like the police telling us that they will only stop bank robbers from robbing the local bank after it has been robbed a certain number of times, or stopping a serial rapist or serial murderer only after a certain number of victims have piled up. There are also many other issues in the funding portion of that bill that continue to have the taxpayers on the hook for the non-governmental organizations, those NGOs, that are facilitating the invasion, along with footing the bill for the lawyers for the criminal illegal aliens. So we can trust the government that is comprised of mostly lawyers to do something that benefits the second oldest profession to the detriment of the liberty of the people they swore an oath to defend and protect. They are wolves feeding on our money and on our lives, all to keep themselves in positions of power and control. Like I said many times, it's high time that the people all turn into Little Red Riding Hood. If you know how that story ends, then you know what I mean. Also, that bill would not have funded the deportation of illegal immigrants, nor was there any funding for a wall. Now I'm going to move on to the next clip that shows just how the leadership in the Biden-Harris White House is nothing more than wolves in sheep's clothing. I'll show it first, then come back with some commentary on the other side. Give this a listen.
2 days since somebody allegedly tried to kill Donald Trump again. And you're here at the podium in the White House briefing room calling him a threat.
President Biden has been clear-eyed about the threat that the former president represents to our democracy.
How many more assassination attempts on Donald Trump until the president and the vice president and you pick a different word to describe Trump other than threat?
Peter, if anything from this administration, I actually completely disagree with the premise of your question, the question that you're asking. It is also incredibly dangerous in the way that you're asking it, because American people are watching. And to say that from an administration who has consistently condemned political violence from an administration where the president called the former president and was thankful, grateful that he was okay, from an administration who has called out January 6th, called out the attack of Paul Pelosi, called out and said we need to lower the temperature after the Butler incident, and now for you to make that kind of comment in your question, because your question involved a comment and a statement. And, it is, that is also incredibly dangerous.
That person that Peter Doocy is engaged with at the White House briefing room is what a wolf in sheep's clothing looks like, folks. And she is the press secretary for the President of the United States of America, a significant leadership position within the executive branch of our government. In that clip you see, or hear if you're listening on audio only, a reporter asking the press secretary when they, and they being the president, vice president, and the rest of the commies in control of the levers of government, along with the other members of the media in the room, this reporter is asking when they will stop calling President Trump a, quote, threat to democracy, unquote, in the hopes of bringing down their rhetoric that has led to 2 assassination attempts on President Trump. And how does she respond? With fake indignation, of course. And the rest of the lapdog media types in the room genuinely applaud that DEI hire, and they believe her rhetoric. And did you catch the part where she did the flipperoo? Where she said that by Peter Doocy asking that question, that was the real danger. That is the point we have arrived to in our nation, ladies and gentlemen, where the government official is telling a member of the national press, which remember, the press is supposed to hold those in power accountable for their words and actions, that asking questions of those in power is what the government official states is incredibly dangerous. She never addressed the facts in the question brought up by Peter Doocy. That's the administration calling repeatedly President Donald Trump a threat. Ladies and gentlemen, we pay her salary. We pay the salaries of everybody that used the rhetoric in question to gin up these attempts on President Trump's life. Now, I really don't want to go over last week's show too much more, but when a member of the new aristocracy is stating a member of the press is acting dangerously by asking them questions and calling out their hypocrisy, is just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of them being the wolves in sheep's clothing, waiting to pounce and destroy the flock. We're going to take a brief break right here and come back on the other side with more examples, so please stick with me. Thanks for bearing with me, folks. Another way in which these members of the deep state, or the new aristocracy, or any number of names that I've used, to become wolves in sheep's clothing is by making the transition from quote-unquote public service over into the propaganda wing of the Communist Party. Those would be the cable news network stations like CNN, MSNBC, and yes, sometimes even Fox News. The list of those people keeps growing by the day. We can start with the ultimate buffoon on cable news, Joe Scarborough. A lot of people are unaware of the fact that he used to be a congressman from Florida way back in the day, a supposed Republican congressman. As a matter of fact, there's something shady about his past. He was the only Republican to resign from the seat he represented in Florida's 1st Congressional District, and he did that around the time of the death of one of his interns. I'm not saying they're connected, but coincidences don't exist, folks. And I love this quote from him that can be found on his Wikipedia page. It states, quote, "It's remarkable that we have a president who's trying to have someone prosecute the person he considers to be his chief critic in the media," unquote. Now, this was stated after President Trump said the investigation into the death of his intern should be reopened. But isn't that just cute, folks? Because that is what the commies have done to Trump. You see, once again, it isn't hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. They are in charge, and the rules for thee, not for me crowd. Right here is a great audio clip of Joe Scarborough being a wolf in sheep's clothing from back during the scandemic. Give it a listen.
You know, it's not just about health. We've said it a million times. If you don't care about how your neighbor is, if you don't care about your children's health, if you're too stupid to care about what your doctor says or science, and you're just looking at QAnon conspiracy theories, or you're just looking at Facebook, wake up, snap yourself out of it. Be selfish if that's what it takes, and know that your small business depends on it. Your job depends on it. Making sure your community stays up and making sure entrepreneurs actually have an economy where they can create businesses, grow jobs. And again, those jobs will mean you will be better off financially as well. So if you can't do it for the right reasons, if you can't do it to protect your children and to protect your neighbors and to protect your communities and protect your friends that you go to church with or go to synagogue with, do it for your bottom line.
Now, the reason it was an audio clip, folks, is because I was unable to download a video, so just the audio. So I created my own little video just for that. That, though, folks, is a member of the national media parroting the government's talking points about the jab. And he has never apologized for the absolute lie he pushed in that segment either. And he pushed it for a reason. Just like the good commies in government, he is an advocate of government control over every aspect of our lives. And it takes coercion to make it happen. What I'm about to show you next should wake up everybody in this nation, especially those fence sitters or the people that just want to be left alone. In this video clip, the sheep's clothing is being completely abandoned by the elected representative when she openly admits to what many people capable of critical thinking have already been made aware of for years, if not decades now. Give this a listen.
What is the point of this subcommittee? Because it's necessary for the public and the media to hear, to try, and provide cover for the eradication of the Department of Justice and the FBI. We are having these hearings so that you become immune. You become inured to the notion of the removal of the FBI and DOJ, so that those agencies are no longer there to serve as a check against white nationalism, great replacement theorists, Christian nationalists, white fragility, fascists, and the twice impeached convicted felon, former president and would-be dictator, Donald Trump.
Were you paying attention to her words, folks, and the meaning behind them? No longer there to serve as a check against white nationalism, great replacement theory, which that's actually a theory put forward by the communists. And we've all been witness to that theory being put into practice unrestrained for the past 3.5 years. But this elected commie continued with Christian nationalists or white fragility, whatever the heck that is, and more. Right there, this elected official admits that the DOJ and FBI has been weaponized by the government against conservatives, and she is warning that the hearing she is participating in is meant to numb the people to the fact that they should, and rightfully so, those organizations should be dismantled. Now, why did I pick those two people? Well, because both started their lives as declared Republicans. Yes, wolves in sheep's clothing, folks. Now, I was going to get into more about them and other members of the deep state, like former CIA Director John Brennan and former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, like I talked about in the intro to the show. And they were two key players in the Russian collusion hoax used to weaponize government against a presidential candidate and then the elected president of the United States, and how they have transitioned from using the power of the government against the people to now using the power of the legacy mainstream media against the people. I had some really good stuff from an appearance by McCabe discussing the second unaliving attempt on President Trump, but I will move into next week's episode on live. You should tune into that because parts of it touch upon an aspect of the big steal that happened in 2020. Anyway, that was the direction of this episode until I had a great conversation with my daughter over the weekend. We talked about some geoengineering reports that may or may not have taken place as it relates to the recent hurricane devastation in North Carolina and right in our backyard of Tennessee. We discussed the government's malfeasance in the so-called recovery efforts, which I will touch upon in my closing thoughts. But she also brought to my attention a news article that surprisingly I had not seen, nor have I heard talked about in the conservative circles at all. The article was in the New York Post and was published on the 30th of September. The article described an appearance that the current vice president and communist candidate for president of the United States made on a podcast. The podcast is titled All the Smoke and is hosted by two former professional basketball players. By no means poor or any level of middle class financially people, which will tie into some of what I'm about to show you. So the hosts of the podcast are Stephen Jackson and Matt Barnes. Anyway, why some of the things Commie-La said on this podcast clearly demonstrate that she, along with the two co-hosts of the show, are nothing more than wolves in sheep's clothing as well. In this first clip, watch how Commie-La almost does it again with her most famous line about her plan to fix the economy, an economy she is directly responsible for wrecking. Yes, I said directly, because as the Vice President of the United States, in that role, she also serves as the President of the United States Senate. And that president casts a vote in the event of ties in that chamber. Well, she was the tie-breaking vote for the artful lie named American Rescue Plan Act and the Inflation Production Act, both of which pumped trillions of dollars of printed money into the economy, which is the sole cause of the record inflation we are experiencing under this communist administration. So here it is.
Economy, small business, black business. We actually just started our business in January, so we've grown from a show to a whole entire company. What is your economic plan moving forward for people who are living paycheck to paycheck and struggling for groceries and rent and homeowners?
So look, I grew up. So my sister and I were raised by our mother. We lived for a long time in an apartment on top of a child care center.
You notice that she had to forcefully stop herself mid-sentence? That is because it is a well-rehearsed line, an act, that her handlers have told her is not polling well. In fact, it's being used against her, so the people behind the curtain told her to back off from that line where she states that her plan is based upon the fact that she was, quote, raised in a middle-class family. Now, next up is this gem. You want to know how to magically increase the cost of every home in America? Well, this is how.
A $25,000 down payment assistance to first-time home buyers.
Mm-hmm. Ta-da! That is another example of a government investment that only enriches the government. By increasing the cost of homes, you increase the amount of taxes paid on those homes. As well as at the outset, the only people getting rich are the mortgage lenders who are now going to get an increase in the interest payments on that new mortgage amount. Voila, folks. Magic. Now, remember the point I made earlier about the background of the two hosts on this podcast? Not poor or middle class by any means, but listen to this guy's statement about the child tax credit.
Part of my plan is also to expand the child tax credit. $6,000 in the first year of your child's life.
Man, I could have used that one.
Yep. The professional athletes who make millions of dollars want that government money too. Everybody wants the handouts. It is no wonder why government has been grown to the size and scope it is right now, and that very few conservatives are elected to office anymore. Because when a true conservative is running for office against a trans-Republican or a commie, they are essentially campaigning against Santa Claus. Santa Claus who brings you quote-unquote free gifts from the government. Not only does the conservative candidate lose, the taxpayers lose whenever those other clowns win the election. Oh, and that brings up an important point about local politics, folks. I'm going to read two quotes, and you tell me if a conservative would actually make these statements. The first one is this, quote, democracy thrives on participation. Let's work together to keep our democratic values strong. Hashtag International Day of Democracy, unquote. Now, the second one, it's this, quote, we must ensure our criminal justice system is fair, just, and focuses on rehabilitation and reducing recidivism, unquote. Now, I want you to ask yourselves if a conservative would make those statements. And while doing so, I want you to also look up who came up with the International Day of Democracy. Then search those two statements and see who made them on social media. Let me just say it as another one of those I told you so's for Sevier County that I promised would be coming. Anyway, back to Commie-La's appearance on the podcast. This is the best part of that podcast that I cannot believe is not getting more traction, especially in the conservative ecosystem. Give this a listen. Oh, wait. But before you do, though, I have to be transparent and let you know I did cut out all the typical fluff in the answer, but I only did it for time's sake. The real juicy part was left in there. So here is the question and the answer. Give it a listen.
What was your process, because it was fast, what was your process and what did you do when you were deciding who to pick for your vice president?
Look, from the time that the president called me and told me he wasn't running, I mean, it just like everything was in speedy motion. And I was not sleeping so well. And that one morning, I had, I don't know, a few hours sleep, and I'd like to sleep.
Yep. We want a person serving in what is probably the most sleep-deprived office at any level of government making decisions like that. What the left and the leftist media is really regretting right now is the decision to have Tampon Tim Walz on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate. We'll cover that some more next week as well, including another outtake from that podcast that is one of the many lies told about your children in our country for the past couple of decades. For now, though, I have sadly run out of time. Please stick with me after this quick break for God's Word, along with my closing thoughts. All right, folks, we're back for my closing thoughts. I know the past couple of shows have been focused on national issues instead of Tennessee-specific issues, and that's because we have a mission right now in front of us to win the national election and slow down the destruction of the republic. The primary elections in Tennessee, they're over, and there's nothing we can do now about the state level, because for Tennessee state government, the primary elections are the general election. The needle is barely moved by the general, which is a sad state of affairs, as we have discussed many times in the past. And it's something we definitely need to address in the future. But always, people, beware the wolf in sheep's clothing. Not only are they in elected office at all levels of government, they are occupying most of the national news media outlets. Organizations that are supposed to be telling we the people the story and letting us come to our own conclusion. Instead, they are telling us a story and attempting to discredit or silence any other aspects that shed a light on the truth. Keep in mind, fact checkers are a new phenomenon that only came about when the powers that be started losing control of the narrative and the people started to think for themselves. And they also had the ability, now that the internet is in the palm of their hands on their smartphones, have the ability to look at a story from many different angles. The different angles weren't as readily available then as they were now, which is causing damage to the government and media symbiotic narrative that used to control the public's perception of every major news story. Now, this week's wisdom from God's Word comes to us from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13. Evil people and pretenders will go from bad to worse. They will fool others, and others will fool them. As we have all been witness to over the past couple of weeks, the evil people and pretenders in our national government have gone from bad to worse. They have fooled the American tax-paying citizens for more than 100 years now, and they have been played for fools on the world stage. Either that, or they have been a willing participant in the fleecing of the citizens in this country with their tax and spend policy that provide more support to foreigners and their country than the support the U.S. government provides to the people here at home. Here are some of the facts that back that up. So far this year, our so-called elected leaders in the U.S. government, which is made up of commies and Republicans, they have provided more than $24 billion to Ukraine, more than $11 billion to Israel, almost $2 billion to Ethiopia, a little bit more than $1.5 billion to Jordan, and nearly the same amount to Egypt, a touch over $1 billion to both Afghanistan and Somalia, $1 billion to Yemen, and nearly that much to Congo and Syria. Only one of those countries I just listed can be called a friend of the United States of America. The usurpers of our liberty and government has also provided nearly $10,000 each to every illegal immigrant that has entered our country. How does that compare to $750 to a family for only some of the American citizens that lost everything during this recent hurricane? Keep in mind, too, folks, that our wannabe President Commie-La is on record that paltry funding will also be distributed based upon equity as well. Not equally among the people that lost everything, but upon equity, which means based upon the melanin content of skin. There's nobody coming to our rescue when things go bad, people, especially not the government that we apathetically let get elected. And also, that government is stopping American citizens that are trying to bring aid and comfort to the areas hit hardest by the flooding and wind damage. FEMA, another federal agency funded by taxpayers, along with other entities of the national government, are actively working against individual recovery efforts being attempted by private citizens to help their neighbors in need. Why, you may ask? Well, it's because it is the national government's ultimate goal to have every person in this country, legally or illegally, become dependent upon the government to be the solution to all of the problems. Despite the fact that government is typically the cause of all of those same problems, they want us all to be dependent on them financially and physically. They control the economy and the medical community and nearly every other aspect of our lives. And then when they institute their mandatory gun buyback of our guns, they will force us to be dependent upon them for our safety. They are evil, and the people that have been fooled into thinking government is the solution has only perpetuated that evil. Well, that's it for this week, folks. Until next week, stand in the arena with me. Reveille, it's time to wake up.